Welcome to Ebrix Gaming and Cards. If you like the content, please like and subscribe. If there is a specific commander you would like to see, please comment below. There are three main considerations when building your mana base: the budget of your deck, the color identity of your commander, and whether you have access to green. Green is a big factor due to all the land ramp, so building a lower budget deck with access to green becomes much easier. We won't be discussing artifact ramp here, but using signets and talismans can help augment your mana base by providing good ramp and color fixing. After we discuss some of the land cycles, I will provide examples of generic land bases. The intent behind this guide is to offer a quick reference and guide for starting your mana base. There are too many variables to create an all-encompassing guide without it being hours long. There are 12 basic lands in Magic the Gathering. There are 5 basic lands that produce colored mana, a basic land that produces colorless mana, and their corresponding snow-covered versions. We have plains and snow-covered plains that produce white mana. White mana is represented by the letter W. Islands and snow-covered islands produce blue mana. Blue mana uses the letter U to represent it. Swamps and snow-covered swamps produce black mana. Black mana uses the letter B to represent it. Mountains and snow-covered mountains produce red mana. Red mana uses the letter R to represent it. Forests and snow-covered forests produce green mana. Green mana uses the letter G to represent it. Wastes and snow-covered wastes produce colorless mana. Colorless mana uses the letter C to represent it. Colorless is a type of mana. This often gets confused with the generic cost of a spell. If a spell requires colorless mana, you must pay with colorless mana. When discussing different color combinations in Magic, each 2-color combination has an official name. They are Azorius, Dimir, Rakdos, Gruul, Selesnya, Orzhov, Izzet, Golgari, Boros, and Simic. The official names of the 3-color combinations are Bant, Esper, Grixis, Naya, Abzan, Jeskai, Sultai, Mardu, and Temur. I have not included all of the land cycles in this guide, just some of the more common land cycles. The first tier we're going to look at is the S tier. These lands are generally considered best in slot. The fetch lands are a staple in multiple formats due to their power. They can fetch any land type listed in the description, not just basics, and they come into play untapped. When you fetch, you get to shuffle your deck. Since there are no mana symbols, you can put these into any deck, even a monocolored deck. An example of a utility land that can be fetched is Mystic Sanctuary. If you don't consider the fetch lands to be the best lands in Magic, then the original dual lands take the spot. They have 2 land types, so they can be fetched in a variety of ways, and they come into play untapped with no drawback. The drawback to these is they are on the reserved list and can be very expensive. The shock lands are similar to the original dual lands, except you have to pay 2 life for them to come into play untapped. In the S tier, we also include lands that can make mana of any color and lands that can give you a mana advantage, like Ancient Tomb and Gemstone Caverns. The next tier of lands are lands that generally come into play untapped and can provide 2 colors of mana. The first A tier we will look at are the Battle Bond lands. In a normal game of Commander, they come into play untapped and provide 2 colors. The reason they are A tier and not S tier is they do not have any land types. The Pain lands come into play untapped, but cost 1 life to produce colored mana. This is generally not a big deal, but can be in some decks that use life as a resource. The Horizon lands are similar to the Pain lands, but they cannot produce colorless mana and always require life. Their main advantage is that, later in the game, you can sacrifice them for card advantage. Mount Doom is like a Pain land, but has its own unique ability. Some miscellaneous lands in this tier can sometimes produce your colors or have a major downside, like Forbidden Orchard. The B-tier lands are generally useful in specific decks when working on a budget. The first B tier we will discuss are the Triomes. If these came into play untapped, they would be more powerful than the original duels. The fact they can make 3 colors and have 3 land types make a great target to fetch if you don't need that mana the same turn. Another benefit is you can cycle them later in the game for card advantage. This cycle ability is what gives them the name of tri-cycle lands. The pathways give you choice between 2 colors, but can only produce the color of your choice. These are generally better in 2-color decks. The fast lands are a great budget option if your game plan revolves around playing spells your first 3 turns, as these will come into play tapped if you have 2 or more other lands. The slow lands are the opposite of the fast lands and are generally used more often in lower power commander decks, as the games generally are slower and last longer. C-tier lands are generally very conditional and require you to build around them to make them valuable. The tainted lands can make colorless mana, but require a swamp to produce colored mana, but do come into play untapped. Keep in mind this condition is any swamp, not just a basic swamp. These are best in a 2-color deck and quickly lose value the more colors you have. The new Verge lands are a little more versatile than the tainted lands because they can always produce 1 color of mana, and the requirement for the second color is one of 2 land types, not just a swamp. The check lands are similar to the Verge lands, but the conditional check is to determine if they come into play untapped, not the type of mana they produce. The reveal lands quickly lose their value as the game goes on, as the odds you have that type of land in your hand decreases. These are a decent budget option if you have a lot of card draw. This cycle of filter lands are generally a good option in 2- and 3-color decks because they can come into play untapped and color fix very well. These filter lands have an advantage over some of the other filter lands because they can create colorless mana. The battle lands can come into play untapped and they have 2 land types. This makes them fetchable. If the condition was easier to meet than basic lands in play, then these would easily be upgraded at least 1 tier. The last tier we will look at are the D tier. These lands are generally chosen due to budget reasons, as there are generally several better options available. This tier starts off with the Odyssey filter lands. These are generally not bad in a 2-color deck, but since they rely on another mana source, they are a bad turn 1 drop. These bounce lands do come into play tapped, but they can bounce themselves back into your hand if you're building around landfall. The other positive is they do not have to bounce an untapped land. The Surveil lands always come into play tapped, but can synergize well with graveyard strategies and can even be fetched since they have land types. The landscapes are a great option for 3-colored decks as they can make colorless mana or fetch for one of their 3 land types. Late game, they can also be cycled for card advantage. The new Capenna lands are unique because they do not have an activated ability. Instead, their fetch is a triggered ability. These lands are also useful in budget decks or decks looking to maximize landfall triggers. A key feature of these lands, like the fetch lands, is that they do not use mana symbols, so they can be included in any deck, including 2-color decks. The miscellaneous lands in this tier can all get a basic land. They are slower, but provide a budget deck with good color fixing and extra landfall options. The next section will give a few generic options and a starting point for a land base. Utility lands are a big part of Commander, so these starting points only have 28 lands each. This provides you the ability to add and trim as needed. For a 2-color deck, I looked for the most popular 2-color commander on EDHREC's website, so we are making a Dimir land base. Keep in mind that some color pairs are inherently more expensive to brew than others. For the budget version, we include a Pain land, a Pathway, and a budget filter land. We include some conditional lands like the Tainted lands and supplement that with ways to get swamps into play. Since this is a 2-color deck, we also are a little heavier on the basics. When we upgrade this to the higher budget, our choices start with the fetches and lands that can be fetched. Then we add lands that provide both of our colors and come into play untapped. For a 3-color mana base, it is a little harder when on a budget, but much easier at higher power levels. Once again, I found the most popular 3-color commander without green in the color identity. This is the Mardu commander Edgar Markov. This is just an example, as if you can afford Edgar Markov, then you are probably not building a budget land base. The good thing about 3 colors is we can add 3 lands from a cycle. So in this case, we first add 3 pain lands and 3 good filter lands. Then we add some conditional lands and ways to get the basic lands for the conditions to be met. For the high budget version, it is very easy. We add all the fetch lands we can, and then targets for those fetches. I always include some basic lands just in case. Then I add lands that produce 2 colors and come into play untapped. A 5-color deck is very hard to build on a budget, but the high-power version is easy. For a 5-color deck, you add your 10 fetch lands, 10 shock lands, and 1 of each basic land, then 3 lands that can produce any color, and bam, your starting point is complete. There are a few lands that are so unique or powerful, I feel I need to at least mention them in this video. The first 3 lands can all produce mana based on how many of something you have. Serra's Sanctum cares about enchantments, and Gaia's Cradle cares about creatures. Both are expensive, but the Cradle is very expensive. If you are looking for this effect, you can use Growing Rites of Itlimoc. And Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, cares about devotion. He next 3 lands all work good in tribal decks. The Cradle of Growth and Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, can mess with land types, while Cabal Coffers synergizes extremely well with Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. Cavern of Souls and Boseiju, who shelters all, can provide protection. Urza's Saga and Inventor's Fair can tutor. And finally, Dryad Arbor, a land that's a creature, but it's not a spell. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and please subscribe to help support this channel.